The ancient pickup truck groaned, protesting the steep incline of the unpaved road. Ethan Miller gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, though not from the effort of driving. He stared ahead, watching the endless tunnel of pines swallow the dusty track whole. Each mile deeper into the Black Creek National Forest felt like another shovelful of earth onto a coffin lid. His old life, buried. That was the point, wasn't it? To bury it deep where the silence could maybe, finally, smother the echoes. Of the hospital room, the sterile beeps, Sarah's hand growing cold in his. He hadn't told the recruiter the whole truth, just that he needed solitude, was good with his hands, didn't mind heights. He'd omitted the part where the city felt like a constant screaming accusation, where every familiar face brought a fresh wave of grief that threatened to drown him. This job, this tower perched on the edge of nowhere, wasn't just employment, it was exile. Self-imposed, but necessary. Finally, the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing dominated by a tall, skeletal structure, the lookout tower, parked. Beside its base was a beat-up Ford Bronco, its tailgate down. A man leaned against it, wiry and weathered, squinting at Ethan's approach. Dale, the outgoing watchman. Introductions were brief, practical. Dale walked him through the generator, the water pump, the radio protocols. His eyes, pale blue and wary, kept flicking towards the dense tree line. "It's quiet up here," Dale said, spitting tobacco juice near Ethan's tire. "Real quiet, sometimes too quiet." He offered a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just remember, the woods get sneaky at night. Don't trust every shadow you see." Ethan nodded, offering a non-committal grunt. Superstition born of isolation, he figured. He watched Dale climb into the Bronco, kicking up dust as he drove away, leaving Ethan utterly alone with the towering pines, the creaking steel structure, and a silence that already felt heavier than anticipated. He was here, buried. Now, he just had to endure the quiet. With Dale gone, the silence clamped down, thick and immediate. Ethan grabbed his duffel bags and cooler, the only companions he'd brought besides the ghosts in his head, and began the long climb up the tower's metal stairs. The wind sighed through the steel grating, a lonely sound that seemed to emphasize his solitude. The cabin at the top was small, functional, and surprisingly clean. A cot was bolted to one wall, a small table and chair to another. Maps covered part of the wall space, marked with grids and fire breaks. But the dominant feature was the wraparound windows, offering a staggering 360-degree view of the forest. Miles upon miles of green, rolling towards a hazy blue horizon. It was beautiful, brutally so. A raw, untamed wilderness that dwarfed his grief, yet somehow echoed its vast emptiness. He spent the first day unpacking, organizing his meager supplies, familiarizing himself with the radio equipment again, tracing potential fire routes on the maps. He tried to establish a rhythm, scan the horizon, make notes, check the weather instruments, scan again. During the daylight hours, it almost felt manageable, peaceful even. He could see the appeal, the detachment Dale had hinted at. But as the sun dipped below the tree line, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, the character of the place shifted. Shadows stretched like grasping fingers from the base of the pines. The familiar daytime sounds, the chirp of birds, the rustle of unseen creatures, faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind and the occasional startling snap of a twig from the darkness below. His first night was restless. Every creak of the tower settling, every gust of wind rattling the windows seemed amplified in the profound quiet. He found himself straining to hear, unsure what he was listening for. More than once, he stood at the windows, peering into the impenetrable blackness surrounding his small island of light. The feeling started then, a prickle on the back of his neck, the distinct irrational sense that he wasn't just looking out, but that something was looking in. He shook his head, blaming nerves, the altitude, the sheer alienness of it all. It was just the silence, he told himself, just the silence getting under his skin. He had to adapt. He would adapt. Several days bled into a week. Ethan settled into the rhythm of the tower, the initial shock of isolation giving way to a dull, monotonous routine. Scan, log, eat, scan, sleep, repeat. He told himself the prickling unease he'd felt that first night had been nothing more than nerves adjusting to the profound quiet. He even started to appreciate the solitude in a detached sort of way, the vast green emptiness, a blank slate compared to the messy canvas of his recent past. The grief was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but out here at least, it didn't feel like it was actively suffocating him. He was on watch, maybe his 5th or 6th night. The moon was a thin crescent, offering little light, and the stars seemed unnaturally bright in the ink-black sky. He swept his gaze across the familiar panorama, the dark sea of treetops stretching endlessly below. Then he saw them, far to the north, maybe 5 or 6 miles out, near the ridge locals called Widow's Peak, where no trails were marked and no structures existed, were lights. Not the steady, distant glow of a campfire or the beam of a flashlight. These were small, like scattered pinpricks, but they pulsed faintly, erratically. They seemed to dance, shifting position with a speed that defied explanation, winking in and out of existence. One moment, there were 3, then 5, then 2, hovering just above the apparent tree line. Ethan raised his binoculars, knuckles tight. The lights remained indistinct, blurry points of luminescence with no discernible source. They weren't aircraft. They moved too strangely, too silently. They weren't on the ground either. He watched, mesmerized and bewildered, for perhaps 10 minutes as they performed their silent, impossible ballet before vanishing abruptly, leaving only the indifferent stars behind. He lowered the binoculars slowly, a chill tracing its way down his spine despite the mild night air. What the hell had that been? Ball lightning, some rare atmospheric phenomenon? His logical mind scrambled for purchase, trying to fit the observation into a neat, explainable box. He dutifully recorded the sighting in the logbook, unidentified. Aerial lights observed approx. 2240, northern sector near Widow's Peak. Erratic movement. Duration approx. 10 mins. But kept the description brief, clinical. He didn't mention the unsettling dance, the way they seemed almost playful. He closed the book, pushing the image from his mind. Strange things happen in the wilderness, he told himself. Weird weather, tricks of the light, nothing more. But as he tried to resume his scan, his eyes kept drifting back to the empty darkness where the lights had been. The following days were unnervingly normal. Sunny skies, a light breeze, the endless green expanse stretching out beneath Ethan's perch. He tried to convince himself the lights had been a fluke, a trick of tired eyes or the thin mountain air. He diligently performed his duties, scanning the horizon for smoke, checking the weather, logging entries that were deliberately mundane. Yet, an undercurrent of tension remained. He found himself listening more intently, his gaze lingering longer. On the shadows between the trees, especially as dusk began to bleed into night. Then the sounds began. It started subtly, easily mistaken for the wind sighing through the pines or the creak of the aging tower. But gradually, Ethan became aware of a different quality to the whispers he sometimes caught on the breeze. They weren't just random noise. They seemed to carry in cadence, like sibilant, hushed speech just beyond the threshold of understanding. He'd whip his head around, straining to hear, pressing his ear against the glass, but the sounds would fade back into the wind's murmur, leaving him feeling foolish and increasingly on edge. Were they real, or was the profound silence finally starting to carve shapes out of the ambient noise? His own mind playing tricks? One night, the ambiguity sharpened into something undeniable. He was reading by the weak glow of the battery-powered lamp, the wind relatively calm outside, when he heard it, a distinct, rhythmic scratching sound coming from the exterior wall just below the catwalk window. Scritch, scratch, scritch, like long fingernails dragging slowly across the wooden siding. His blood ran cold. He froze, listening, heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't an animal. It lacked the frantic scrambling of a squirrel or raccoon. This was methodical, deliberate. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight, switched it on, the beam cutting a sharp cone through the dim cabin. Taking a deep breath, he unlatched the door, leading to the narrow metal catwalk that encircled the cabin, and stepped outside, sweeping the light across the walls below. Nothing. Just the weathered wood, the dark bolts securing the structure, the vast emptiness dropping away into the blackness below. The scratching had stopped the instant the door opened. He circled the entire catwalk, flashlight beam probing the shadows, finding no animal, no broken branch scraping in the wind, nothing. To explain the sound, he retreated back inside, bolting the door, the metallic click echoing loudly in the sudden silence. Rational explanations felt flimsy now, inadequate. The lights could have been dismissed. The whispers, maybe imagination. But the scratching, that felt different. That felt close, targeted. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague prickle. It was a heavy weight pressing in from the darkness, unseen eyes fixed intently on his small, isolated cage of light and glass. The woods weren't just quiet, they were waiting, and Ethan was starting to be truly afraid. Sleep offered little escape that night. Every creak of the tower, every sigh of the wind had Ethan jolting upright, flashlight clutched in a sweaty palm. Dawn arrived pale and gray, finding him exhausted but resolute. Fear was a paralyzing poison, but ignorance felt just as dangerous. If something was out there, truly out there, he needed to understand what he was facing. Hiding under the blankets wouldn't cut it. After forcing down some instant coffee that tasted like ash, he turned to the stack of old logbooks stored in a dusty cabinet beneath the radio equipment. He'd skimmed them before, but now he searched with a desperate focus, ignoring the routine weather entries and scanning for anything unusual, anything that echoed his own experiences. He found more than he bargained for. Scattered across decades, tucked between mundane reports of dry lightning and equipment checks, were fragments of fear. One entry from the 70s mentioned dancing devils near Widow's Peak, dismissed by the writer as heat shimmer. Another from the early 90s spoke of voices in the static that seemed to whisper the watchman's name. A more recent log, maybe 10 years old, contained a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. Can hear it circling below, scratching, like bone on wood. Knows I'm alone. The entry ended there. The next page was blank, followed by a new logbook, started by a different watchman weeks later. Ethan felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't imagining it. Others had heard the scratching, heard the voices, seen the lights. What had happened to the man who wrote that last entry? His hand reached for the radio microphone. Protocol dictated reporting unusual activity, but he'd hesitated before, fearing ridicule. Now, fear of the unknown outweighed fear of embarrassment. He keyed the mic, calling the main ranger station, his voice tighter than he intended. Black Creek lookout to base, over. Static crackled in response. He tried again, increasing the volume. More static, thicker this time, punctuated by odd clicks and whistles. He could faintly hear a voice buried deep within the noise, but it was distorted, unintelligible. Base, this is Ethan Miller at the lookout. Are you reading me? I need to report. He mentioned the lights, the sounds. The static surged violently, drowning him out before the radio fell completely silent. Dead air. He tried hailing them again and again over the next hour, checking connections, fiddling with the frequency dial. Nothing. It was as if the airwaves themselves had died or been deliberately severed. He thought of Dale's parting words, the man's wary eyes scanning the trees. Had Dale known more than he let on? Had he experienced these things too? There was no way to ask now. The logbooks offered grim confirmation, but the radio's silence screamed a more terrifying truth. He was utterly cut off. Whatever haunted this place, he was facing it alone. And the sky outside was beginning to darken, the air growing heavy. With the promise of the storm, meteorology had predicted, the storm didn't just arrive, it assaulted the tower. The sky, already bruised and heavy, ruptured. Rain lashed against the windows in blinding sheets, driven by a wind that howled like a hungry beast around the exposed cabin. The entire structure groaned and shuddered under the onslaught, a tiny metal boat tossed on a furious ocean of air. Down below, the forest became a thrashing, roaring entity, trees swaying violently, their branches clawing at the sky. Ethan felt the isolation clamp down like a physical weight. The dead radio was a constant mocking presence on the table. Even if the roads weren't already becoming impassable mudslides, leaving the relative safety of the tower now would be suicide. He was trapped, suspended between the angry sky and the haunted earth. The storm provided a chaotic symphony that masked the smaller, more insidious sounds for a time. But then, cutting through the roar of the wind and the drumming rain, he heard it again, the scratching. Lower this time, near the base of the tower, but unmistakable. He imagined long, sharp claws or bony fingers dragging against the metal support beams hidden in the deluge below. He paced the small cabin like a caged animal, peering out into the maelstrom. Visibility was almost zero, just swirling grey sheets of water. Then, a brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the clearing below for a fraction of a second. And in that stark, momentary glare, Ethan saw it, standing just inside the tree line, partially obscured by a thick pine, was a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs seemingly too long for its body. It was drenched, motionless, and appeared to be staring directly up at the tower. At him. It wasn't human. The proportions were wrong, the stillness unnatural amidst the raging storm. Before Ethan could even process the image, darkness slammed back down, leaving only the ghost of the figure burned onto his retinas. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed its way up his throat. It was real. It was outside. He stumbled back from the window, heart pounding. Was it the source of the scratching, the whispers? Was it what the previous watchman had feared? As if sensing his terror, the single bare bulb powered by the generator flickered erratically. Once, twice, then plunged the cabin into absolute darkness, save for the strobing flashes of lightning outside. He fumbled for his flashlight, its beam weak against the oppressive gloom. The generator sputtered back to life after a long moment, the light returning, weak and yellow, but Ethan's nerve was shot. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every gust of wind sounded like an attempt to force entry. He checked the locks on the door and windows for the 10th time, his hands shaking. The logbooks hadn't mentioned seeing anything so clearly. Had it grown bolder? Or were previous watchers simply too afraid to write it down? The storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest. In his own mind, he was besieged, trapped in his metal cage, while something ancient and patient waited in the rain below. And the night was far from over. Hours crawled by, measured only by the relentless drumming of rain and the frantic ticking of Ethan's own pulse. The storm showed no sign of abating. If anything, the wind seemed to shriek with renewed fury, rattling the tower's frame until Ethan felt the vibrations in his teeth. He sat huddled on the cot, flashlight beam dancing nervously across the cabin walls, exhaustion warring with stark terror. The scratching sounds had started again, intermittent but closer now, seeming to travel up the steel legs of the tower itself, a slow, deliberate ascent from the dark forest floor. Then came the knocking. It wasn't the random impact of debris flung by the wind. This was heavy, rhythmic, insistent, Thump, thump, thump. Right on the main door leading out to the narrow catwalk, the only entrance to the cabin. Ethan froze, flashlight beam locking onto the rattling metal door. His breath hitched. Impossible. No one could have climbed the exposed stairs in this gale. No one could even reach the tower base with the roads washed out. Rescue teams wouldn't attempt it without radio contact. Not in this weather, not in the dead of night. It couldn't be human. Thump, thump, thump. Louder this time, shaking the door in its frame. He scrambled backwards, pressing himself against the cold maps on the far wall, the flashlight trembling violently in his grip. "Who's there?" he croaked, the sound pathetic against the storm's roar. Silence answered for a moment, only the wind and rain. Then a voice spoke, clear and chillingly close, right outside the door. "Ethan? Honey, it's me. Let me in." Ethan's heart stopped. He knew that voice, every inflection, every soft cadence. It was Sarah's voice, his Sarah, the voice he hadn't heard in 18 agonizing months, the voice that haunted his dreams. "Let me in, Ethan. It's so cold out here. Please open the door." Tears sprang to his eyes, hot tears of shock, grief, and dawning horror. He wanted to believe it, wanted it so desperately that the urge to lunge for the door handle was almost overwhelming. A miracle, somehow impossibly, Sarah was here. But his rational mind screamed. Sarah was gone, buried. The entity he'd seen, in the lightning, the thing that scratched its way up the tower, the presence hinted at in the terrified scribbles of long-dead watchmen. That was what stood outside his door. And it knew him. It knew his loss, his deepest pain, and it was twisting it into a cruel mockery, a horrific weapon. "No," he whispered, shaking his head, the tears turning cold on his cheeks. "You're not her." A pause. The wind howled, rattling, the window panes like skeletal fingers. Then Sarah's voice came again, but the warmth was gone, replaced by something flat, cold, and anciently malicious. "Open the door, Ethan." It wasn't a plea anymore. It was a command. Thump, thump, thump. The pounding resumed, harder now, shaking the entire cabin. He could hear the metal groaning around the doorframe. The point of no return had arrived with a sickening lurch. This thing wasn't just a random forest spirit or a trick of the light. It was intelligent, it was malevolent, and it wanted in. Denial was stripped away, leaving only raw terror and the sickening realization that the fight for his life, and maybe his sanity, had just begun in deadly earnest. The relentless pounding stopped as abruptly as it began, plunging the small cabin into a different kind of torment. Silence, thick with menace and the howl of the storm outside. Ethan remained pressed against the wall, flashlight beam trembling, ears straining against the sudden quiet. He knew it wasn't over. It was changing tactics. Then, subtly at first, the air inside the cabin shifted. A faint, sweet scent began to permeate the stale air. Lilac and vanilla, Sarah's perfume. The scent she wore on their wedding day, the scent that lingered on her pillow the morning she... He squeezed his eyes shut, a raw sob catching in his throat. It couldn't be real. It was the thing outside, somehow projecting it, digging into his memories like a parasite. "Why didn't you hold my hand tighter, Ethan?" The whisper seemed to come from directly behind him, intimate and cold. Sarah's voice again, laced with an unnatural echo. He spun around, flashlight beams slicing through empty air. Nothing there. "You were looking at the monitor, not at me," the voice whispered, now seeming to emanate from the dark corner near the cot. "You saw the line go flat before I did?" "Stop it," Ethan choked out, backing away, stumbling over his own feet. "You're not her. Leave me alone." Shadows cast by the weak, flickering generator light seemed to twist and coalesce in the periphery of his vision. He caught fleeting glimpses, the curve of a cheekbone, a fall of dark hair that looked agonizingly like Sarah, but they vanished. When he tried to focus, leaving only the bare walls and the oppressive sense of being watched by something deeply cruel. Fragments of memory, distorted and weaponized, assaulted him. The sterile smell of the hospital room intensified, mingling horribly with the lilac perfume. He heard the rhythmic, ominous beep of the heart monitor, the hushed, pitying tones of the doctor. The entity wasn't just mimicking Sarah. It was replaying the worst moments of his life, twisting his grief into guilt, his love into a source of unbearable pain. "It should have been you," the voice hissed, laced with venom, seemingly coming from everywhere at once now. "You were always the weak one." He clapped his hands over his ears, screwing his eyes shut, trying to block it out, but the voice echoed inside his skull. Was he going mad? Was this the ultimate effect of the isolation, his own broken mind conjuring these horrors? Or was the entity outside somehow peeling back the layers of his psyche, exposing every raw nerve? He didn't know how long he endured the assault. Time lost meaning, measured only in waves of psychological torment. He was weakening, the careful walls around his grief crumbling under the targeted attack. He found himself weeping openly, curled on the floor, the flashlight lying nearby, its beam casting frantic circles on the ceiling. The entity wanted him broken, wanted him to give in to despair, and gods, it was working. He felt a sliver of his resolve crack, a dangerous whisper in his own mind, wondering if opening the door would bring oblivion, an end to this unbearable pain. That thought, that flicker of surrender, was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. Just as Ethan felt the last vestiges of his resistance crumbling, the scent of lilac faded, the insidious whispers died away. A heavy, expectant silence fell within the cabin, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the undiminished fury of the storm outside. He lay curled on the floor, trembling, uncertain if the reprieve was real or just another cruel twist. Then, the door exploded inwards, not a gradual yielding, but a violent splintering crash as something immense slammed into it from the outside. Wood shrieked and tore, metal groaned, and the top hinge ripped free. The door hung crazily inwards, exposing a jagged opening to the tempestuous night and the thing that waited on the catwalk. Adrenaline, raw and primal, surged through Ethan, obliterating the suffocating grief. Survival instinct roared to life. He scrambled backwards, crab-crawling away from the breach, his eyes wide with terror. Framed in the broken doorway, silhouetted against the strobing lightning, stood the figure he'd seen by the tree line. It was worse up close, taller than seemed possible, skeletal thinness wrapped in what looked like shifting shadows or drenched rags. Its limbs were elongated, jointed at unnatural angles. It had no discernible face, just a smooth, pale oval that seemed to drink the light, radiating an unnatural cold that cut through the cabin's air. Long, spindly fingers, ending in what looked like shards of obsidian, gripped the edge of the broken doorframe. It made no sound, yet its presence screamed. Malice. The thing unfolded itself, stooping unnaturally low to begin forcing its way through the splintered opening. Ethan's mind raced. The heavy flashlight was useless. He needed something more. His eyes darted around the cabin, landing on the emergency kit bolted near the radio table, the signal flare gun. He lunged for it, fumbling with the clasp, his fingers slick with cold sweat. He snapped it open, jammed one of the thick red cartridges into the breech, and slammed it shut just as the entity's shadowy head and one impossibly long arm were clearing the doorway. It moved with a jerky, stop-motion quality that was deeply wrong, its eyeless face fixed on him. A low clicking sound, like insects chittering, emanated from its direction. Ethan raised the flare gun with shaking hands, aiming squarely at the center of the encroaching mass. There was no time for thought, only reaction. He squeezed the trigger with a deafening whoosh and a flash of blinding magnesium white light. The flare ignited, rocketing out of the barrel. It struck the entity square in the chest. The reaction was instantaneous and horrific. A piercing, multi-toned shriek ripped through the air, overriding the storm's roar, a sound of agony, fury, and something utterly alien. The intense light seemed to burn it, causing the shadowy form to recoil violently, smoke or vapor rising from the point of impact. The creature flinched back, stumbling on the narrow catwalk, its long limbs flailing. It clutched at its chest, where the flare had hit, the pale oval of its face seeming to contort in silent agony. With another guttural clicking screech, it lurched backwards, away from the doorway, away from the searing light. It scrambled clumsily on the wet metal grating of the catwalk before launching itself over the railing, disappearing into the sheeting rain and the howling darkness below. Ethan was left gasping, deafened by the flare's roar and the entity's shriek, the acrid smell of burnt magnesium filling the cabin. The broken door swung gently in the wind, revealing only the empty, storm-lashed catwalk. He was alive, trembling, possibly broken, but alive. The immediate threat had retreated. For now, Ethan didn't move for a long time, listening to the receding storm and the frantic thumping of his own heart. The acrid scent of the spent flare hung heavy in the air. He kept his eyes fixed on the broken doorway, expecting the tall, shadowy figure to reappear at any moment. But nothing moved out on the catwalk except the dripping rain and the sighing wind, which was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to lessen. As the first pale hints of dawn stained the eastern horizon grey, the storm began to break. The torrential rain softened to a drizzle, the wind's howl diminished to a mournful moan. A fragile quiet settled over the forest, profoundly different from the menacing silence of the night before. It felt empty, clean, as if the light itself was purging the oppressive presence that had besieged him. He finally pushed himself stiffly to his feet, every muscle aching. He surveyed the damage, the splintered door, the lingering smell, the deep gouges near the window where something had tried to claw its way in earlier. It was real. All of it. With trembling hands, driven by a desperate need to reconnect with the human world, he tried the radio again. Miraculously, through the fading static, he heard a faint voice acknowledging his call sign. His own voice was a hoarse whisper as he reported the storm damage and requested immediate extraction, citing structural instability and personal distress. He didn't mention the creature, the voice, the siege. Who would believe him? Hours later, under a washed-clean sky, the distant thumping of a helicopter grew louder. When the rescue crew finally reached the damaged cabin, they found Ethan huddled on the cot, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at the far wall. They noted the damage, attributing it to the severe storm. They saw his state, blaming it on shock and prolonged isolation. He didn't correct them. He let them lead him away from the tower, down the treacherous stairs, leaving the broken door swinging slightly in the breeze. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying him away from Black Creek Lookout forever, Ethan looked down at the vast, indifferent ocean of trees. It looked peaceful now, deceptively serene under the morning sun, but he knew what lurked beneath the canopy, what waited in the deep shadows and the long nights. He had survived, but a part of him remained trapped in that tower, forever listening for whispers on the wind, forever haunted by the echoes of Sarah in a voice that was not her own. The city wouldn't be a refuge. Nowhere would be. The woods had shown him a darkness he could never unsee.